Hi, I'm Steve Hamilton, presenting for CityTram. Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results. Today, I'm going to attempt to end the insanity regarding transit. In America, the term public transit and mass transit have become interchangeable. While almost all transit agencies offer some on-demand services called special transit service, primarily for disabled people, these services are a minor activity. The overwhelmingly dominant activity of public transit agencies, measured in dollars or rides or employees or whatever, is providing mass transit service. Now, I think that's a mistake, a fatal one, and it's why public transit agencies are failing, but that's a different discussion. This presentation is about mass transit service. Agencies typically provide multiple mass transit services based upon differing technologies, and often deploying multiple subcategories for each technology. We have trolleys and circulator buses, municipal buses, express buses, commuter buses, and bus rapid transit. We have streetcars, light rail, hybrid rail, commuter rail, and heavy rail. But all of these represent a single transit architecture, which we call mass transit. This architecture is defined by manually driven, large volume, shared use vehicles following a fixed route according to a fixed schedule. This is a bad architecture. And don't just take my opinion for this, look at the evidence. 820 urban transit agencies have spent the last 40 years implementing literally thousands of mass transit projects. Look at the results. These projects have proven that mass transit will not motivate car users to migrate to public transit. And anywhere that it can, just a little, it can only do so at tremendous cost. Now, everyone's always quick to point out, New York and Chicago is having good transit systems. Well, the Chicago Transit Authority has a fare box ratio of 43%, and New York's MTA a ratio of 45%. Yes, these are among the best fare box results in the nation, but that's my point. They lose more than 100% as a percentage of revenues on humongous revenues. If you spend just a little bit of time in analysis, you can understand why mass transit will never be successful in achieving that aim, migrating car users, under anything like the current conditions. The purpose of this presentation is to show precisely that analysis. Let me start by giving you the story in a nutshell. You can then decide if you want to stay for the details. First, mass transit is a partial solution at best. There is no mass transit market. There is a personal transit market. Trying to serve personal transit demand with a mass transit service leaves portions of that personal transit demand unfulfilled, and therefore is a non-competitive offering. This severely limits the portion of the total available market that can access the service. Second, we have a three-step death spiral. Step one, the cost of providing the service is very high. The large volume vehicles are expensive both to purchase and to operate. On top of that, the required human drivers add to the operating costs and are in fact the largest portion of the operating costs. Step two, the ridership threshold required to cover these large operating costs is quite large. In some cases, they're larger than the demand can actually satisfy, like in the suburbs or maybe at off-peak operating hours. In almost all cases, these thresholds are larger than can be covered by the locked-in customers who don't have an alternative means of commuting. So it is a requirement to appeal to customers who do have access to a car. Step three, the decision process by which potential customers decide how to commute essentially resolves for these car-available commuters based upon trip speed. This architecture cannot compete successfully against cars based upon trip speed. So car available commuters do not convert. Finally, the nature of the architecture embodies a set of negative feedbacks that prevent effectively tuning it to address these problems. Adjustments that would increase speed also significantly increase costs and/or reduce coverage and therefore access to the available market. Adjustments that increase coverage and/or lower cost also decrease speed. All adjustments require prediction rather than reaction. These 2 points result in a service that perpetually requires significant subsidization in order to serve the 5% share of the market who have no access to cars, while the 90% share of the market stay in their cars. Sound familiar? Let's take a more detailed look. Our riders have no interest in mass transit. Their need is for personal transit. All transit is personal. A personal trip is defined by a starting point, the destination, and the travel time, all of which are specific to a single individual. Now, it may be our decision to provide for that personal transit using a mass transit technology because we think brings us some benefits somehow. But we should be careful in making such decisions to keep the customer's perspective of value front and center. When we serve a personal trip with a shared mass transit service, we break that trip into 3 consecutive segments, with the middle segment in common with other such trips. Now, as long as that common segment dominates the trip for all of these shared trips, then the shared implementation of it does not overly burden the individual personal trips. In short, mass transit can be used for personal transit conveniently in that case. We only take responsibility for that common mass transit segment, as we do today, and we risk that the rider's solution for the end segments, whatever it might be, is equally applicable to his whole trip. If the common segment then places any burden at all and makes his trip worse, then he'll choose instead to use that other solution for the whole trip. Today, we leave mass transit riders on their own for the start and end segments. This limits access to our service to a short walking distance around transit stops. Thus, it limits our coverage of the total available market, eliminating potential riders. Our target market segment, those with cars, can drive to the pickup stop and thus can actually come from a longer distance. But that requires parking somewhere nearby, and it risks that the rider won't just drive the whole trip instead. And it only works for one end of the trip. So coverage is still limited at the destination. The rider has an end-to-end, that is a door-to-door need. Those end segments are not in common. They are not solvable with mass transit. Only the middle segment is amenable to mass transit. So mass transit is a partial solution at best, and therefore for most potential riders, a non-competitive solution. Because bus service is the most prevalent service and the service that provides the most rides, I'm going to use it as an example to show you the death spiral in detail. Now, if you think there's something especially problematic about buses, so that some other mass transit technology can magically deliver us from this spiral, then I challenge you to go dig out the numbers. The numbers move around a little bit, but the spiral is still there. It's not the technology that's the problem, it's the architecture. The 820 urban transit agencies I referred to collectively provide 98% of the transit trips each year. The Association of Public Transit Agencies, APTA, publishes a fact book annually to share information about their performance, and more details can be accessed in the National Transit Database maintained by the US DOT. Miami-Dade does not make it easy to break out the numbers by service, so I'm using the 2015 year because that's the recent year for which I could find the best breakout data. A provider will never have all of its buses in service. There must be some in reserve as replacements in case of breakdowns, and routing service takes some out of service. Routine service takes some out of them out of service. So 20 to 25% excess is maintained. This lowers the effective productivity of these already expensive assets. But the biggest expense is actually in salaries and benefits for the drivers. Depending on how many hours a day the service is available, you may need 2 or 3 shifts of drivers for each vehicle. These driver-related costs are in the range of 55% to 65% of all operating costs. All things accounted for, it costs approximately $400,000 a year to keep a single bus in service. Not happy with the level of service on your local bus route? Want the agency to put another bus on that route to shorten the headway? You're asking them to spend another $400,000. This works out in the neighborhood of about $10 for every mile the bus travels in service. Now you'll have to forgive me. I'm a math major, so I'll never understand accounting. The accountants want to reduce operating losses by subtracting depreciation. That makes no sense to me. It's true, we've already paid for the buses that we are currently operating, but they will wear out one day. They only have a useful life of about 12 years. So if we want to stay in business, we need to put aside some extra money to pay for that replacement bus in the future. Buses cost about $500,000 each, so I would add about $1 per mile to the actual operating costs. But the accountants don't do that, so I won't either. Going forward, we'll use the $10 per mile cost per revenue mile, actually, in the next step in the spiral. One of the worst aspects of the mass transit architecture is it forces the provider to engage in prediction and gambling. In order to set the fixed routes and fixed schedules, the provider must predict ridership. Who'll need to go from where to where and when each day, and what is the pattern in that demand that's likely to repeat reliably. Then, once the prediction is done, a set of routes and schedules is defined that'll serve it. Next, the provider's got to pay for the full amount to implement that. Physical infrastructure is placed along the routes at the bus stops, so this solution must be relatively stable. The buses and drivers are deployed according to the schedules to roll through the defined revenue miles. Then, either the riders come, hey, we win, or they don't. Oh, sorry, you lose. And the gambling doesn't stop there. When you don't like the results that you're getting, do you bet more on the theory that a shorter headway will get more riders, knowing that if you're wrong, you'll lose even more? Or do you cut back in order to save money, knowing that it's going to hurt the quality of the service? So gambling is a terrible business model. Okay, so how good are we at it? Well, not that good. The number of riders who come and the number of miles that they ride is shown here, both nationwide and locally. You can spread our costs to provide the service across those riders and compute the cost to provide each. When you compare that to the revenue that the rider pays, you get the fare box ratio. The riders only pay us 28.4% of what it costs us to provide the ride. In other words, our enterprises lose 252% as a percentage of revenues. Now, it's interesting how consistent these results are, locally versus the nation. That's due to the system itself being broken rather than our local implementation of it. It's notable that day riders take much shorter trips than average. My guess is that's the local climate contributing to that difference. But this difference really doesn't change much, except the effective price per mile of the service, which is totally under the consumer's control. With mass transit losing so much money, it becomes increasingly difficult to expand its service. Adding buses to existing routes can shorten headways, which reduces waiting time, which improves the quality of the service. Adding more routes improves coverage, thus making the service available to more riders. But it's hard to justify increasing capacity of a system that's already underutilized. The ratio of passenger miles to revenue miles tells us the average number of people on each bus. 10.18 people on a bus with 53 seats is just over 19% utilization. Now in Dade, because of the shorter trips people take, the occupancy is even lower than that. The good news for our mass transit situation is that we've already placed our bet. The expenses of our fixed route, fixed schedule are already paid. So our incremental cost is literally zero. Each additional rider is all incremental revenue and no incremental cost. So how many new riders do we need in order to raise the fare box ratio to 1 to have break-even operation? The ratio between our current ridership and occupancy and the break-even ridership and occupancy is 3.52. So we need to increase our ridership by 252% in order to break even. How do we do that? Well, transit currently has about a 5% share of the market of commuters. The size of that market is pretty much fixed, right? The people who commute are the people who commute. So to gain market share, we're going to have to steal it from other forms of commuting to the tune of about 13% of that market. To understand that 13%, we need to take a look at the total available market. A number of different studies and reports are available, and they all tell us pretty much the same thing. The one shown here is from the U.S. Census Bureau. It focuses on just trips to and from work. Now, I've added the numbers along the left, which throws out the 4.4% of people who work from home and therefore don't commute, and it adjusts the other percentages accordingly. Transit already has a 5.5% share of the market, and there's no way to significantly expand that market. As I said, the people that commute are the people that commute. So to expand our share, we steal share from the competition. We can either go after the 4.9% of people who commute by foot, by bike, or by other means, or we can go after the 89.7% who commute by car, either alone or in a group. Now, people who are close enough to walk are probably not likely targets, and just getting some portion of 4.9% really is not big enough to change the situation anyway. So really, we have no choice. We must convince car users to convert. We need to know more than just which commuters we're going after. We need to know how those potential customers make their purchase decisions. All CityTram analysis is based upon the commuter decision model which we've developed and which we believe to date has proven an accurate model for the market. It says that for each trip, the commuter first does a pass-fail filter on the available commuting options. Will I feel safe? Does it go where I need to go? Can it handle any cargo I might need to take on this trip? And is it flexible enough? For example, I can use it to get to the baseball game, but if the game goes extra innings, can I still get home? Or if my wife might need me to pick up our child from music lessons on the way home, can I reroute on the fly? Choosing among those options that pass through this filter is pretty simple. What's the fastest way that I can afford? For the biggest chunk of our total available market, an 89.7% size chunk, one of the available options is access to a personally owned automobile. That's our competition. So our customer decision model says that the decision will be based upon speed and cost. We need to know where we stand competitively on both. Let's look at cost first. Obviously, the cost of ownership varies from car to car. The center point around which that variation occurs is 73 cents per mile. The two biggest components of this ownership are the actual purchase price and the fuel costs. Collectively, these are about 2/3 of the total cost. Obviously there's some more expensive and less expensive cars and more fuel efficient and less fuel efficient cars. The cost of ownership also varies from owner to owner based upon how much the car is driven. In this graph, we compare the cost of car ownership for various entities, assuming a $30,000 vehicle with a useful life of 200,000 miles. The middle three bars in the graph show the costs per mile for private ownership, assuming a trade-in after 7 years. The average owner in the middle drives 12,500 miles per year. The light owner above that drives only half as much, and the heavy owner below that drives twice as much. The topmost bar shows the cost the average owner would experience if he was a smart, patient, and disciplined buyer who buys the car and rather than trading it in, he drives it till it wears out after 16 years. The bottom bar shows the cost per mile if a commercial entity, a taxi company in this case, operates the vehicle and gets, on average, 10 paying riders per day, so that the vehicle racks up 10 times the same number of miles as the average owner. Now, the magic is that some of the operating costs for the car are mileage-based while others are time-based. Fuel, maintenance, and repairs are mileage-based. These costs are the same for all owners. But vehicle purchase, financing, registration and licensing, and insurance are time-based. So the more rapidly the vehicle accumulates miles, the lower the per mile contribution of those costs. We can see that the average American pays 73 cents per mile for his personal car, with 19 cents of that being the boredom fee he pays for trading in his car before it wears out. The taxi vehicle, representing somewhat of a lower limit, is cheaper at about 42 cents per mile. But the population of typical owner drivers pay between 50 cents per mile and $1.21 per mile to operate their cars. The customers we seek to convert have already established that costs in this range satisfy their definition of affordable. So transit costs in this range will get us into the final decision-making process based on speed. If we're successful at attracting car users to mass transit, and we want to operate near break-even, then we need to collect from the riders fares that cover their costs on a per-mile basis. You see those here. So we see that bus systems are not as affordable as car ownership. The difference can be mitigated in the market with subsidization so that buses are equally as affordable as cars to our customers. But this needs to be a temporary action to steal market share from cars. Unfortunately, history over the last 40 years shows us we've been unable to grow that market share despite substantial subsidization. So we must have other problems. Let's look at speed. How does a bus trip stack up on that? Now, city speed limits are typically 30 to 35 miles per hour. Many drivers exceed them, but traffic lights keep cars stopped for some amount of time. So the average pace of progress for a car in the city, not at rush hour, will vary depending on how many lights are encountered. And that pace will vary roughly between about 11 miles per hour and 22 miles per hour, with the average being about 16 and a half. If you ask somebody, how fast does your car go? You might get a variety of answers. Some people will answer using the biggest number on their speedometers. Others, how fast they've actually driven, or maybe how fast they usually drive on the freeway. The right answer is probably the posted speed limit, because that's how fast they're permitted to drive. But it's important to remember, that's the maximum speed, not the average speed. What really matters to commuters, the thing that leaves the psychological impression, is the average speed. What they actually care about is how long the trip takes them. That's the quantity they plan their lives around. So any fair speed comparison must be wholly inclusive, counting the time from door to door. The trip both starts and ends walking with the vehicle used in the middle. Our customers don't care how fast the bus goes. They care how long their bus trip takes. The APTA fact book for 2016 says that buses travel at 14.1 miles per hour. I'm going to be generous and use a value of 20 miles per hour. The average bus trip is 4.6 miles. This analysis shows a 4.5 mile trip. A bus stop every 3/4 of a mile is assumed. Again, I'm being a little generous according to national statistics, and I'm assuming a 30-minute headway in my model. Now, mass transit has a really serious marketing problem. When I want to go somewhere on mass transit, my experience is dominated by walking, waiting, and stopping. These words are poison from a marketing perspective. And what's worse, they're accurate. Even though my vehicle travels at 20 miles per hour, what my trip actually delivers is 7 miles per hour. A bike is likely faster. Now, I know this slide is a little bit of an eye chart, and I apologize for that. It shows a spreadsheet I created to model this case. The yellow cells are inputs that describe the situation. The time section shows the results and time breakdown of the trip. The rider spends 10 minutes walking, 15 minutes waiting for the vehicle, 3.8 minutes in the vehicle stopped at bus stops along the way, and only 13.9 minutes in a moving vehicle. The total trip takes 42.7 minutes to go 4.5 miles. That's 7 miles an hour. Wouldn't you take a car if you had one? Now, I created the spreadsheet so that I could do some sensitivity analysis. If we want to fix the bus travel, that is, increase its speed, then we need to know what are the most effective levers to pull. The spreadsheet allows me to systematically attack each of the time buckets and change the input conditions that affect each to see which have the biggest impact on the customer experience. The first trial increases vehicle speed from 20 miles per hour to 30 miles per hour, which reduces time spent in the moving vehicle. I labeled the scenario suburbs since it's closer to a suburban reality. Trip speed increases, but only by about 10% to 7.8 miles per hour. Next, I tried the express bus route approach. Skipping 2 of every 3 bus stops reduces the time in a stopped vehicle. This also increases trip speed, but not quite as much. We get 7.6 miles per hour with this approach. It obviously negatively impacts coverage as the bus is no longer accessible from 2/3 of the stations. Next, I cut headway from 30 minutes to 10 minutes to reduce the wait time. We already have excess capacity and a cost problem. So I've labeled this trial van to suggest that we're going to swap out our fleet of big 40-foot buses for a slightly bigger fleet of smaller and cheaper vans. Reducing headway has a big impact, about 31%. We get to 9.2 miles per hour. Finally, let's try to shorten the walk. Increasing the stop density will also add more stop time. So instead, let's somehow increase the speed of the walk. And suppose we use moving sidewalks to double walking speed. This gets 14% gain to 8 miles an hour. So the best bus system that we could design will probably use smaller vehicles and more of them to reduce headway. And it might be enhanced in places with some method to accelerate access to the bus stops. Moving sidewalks, electric skateboards, segways, golf car shuttles, who knows? But can it beat a car? As I explained before, the average pace of a car in the city is about 16.5 miles an hour. But for apples to apples comparison, I'm using the same pace value that I use for the bus, 20 miles per hour. We've already done a great deal in our society to make cars accessible We spend a lot of land area on parking lots, and our zoning codes require them to be close to where the people are. So I've reduced the walking distance for cars in this model. Otherwise, the input parameters are identical to the bus scenarios. Total trip time is only 18.5 minutes. That's 4 minutes walking and 14.5 minutes in a moving vehicle. The time stopped at traffic lights is accounted for in the 20 miles per hour vehicle speed, just like for the bus. No time is lost waiting or in the vehicle stopped at intermediate points. The result is a 16.2 mile per hour trip. That's 131% faster than the bus and 76% faster than the best bus. Note that even if I reduce the car speed by half to model what might happen at rush hour, the car is still roughly a match for the best bus. But we're not running frequent van service. And even if we did, their speed would also degrade in rush hour. We're left to conclude that not even the best bus can compete with a car for trip speed. Okay, so I think we're left with a pretty consistent picture, albeit an unpleasant one. If you believe our commuter decision model is accurate, and I do, then you must conclude that bus-based mass transit simply cannot compete with personal car transit. Buses are more costly to operate than cars. A significant increase in ridership is needed to bring the costs in line with that of cars. The only available source of that increased ridership is among commuters who already have access to cars. But since the key decision criteria is speed, buses lack sufficient value to attract those extra riders. Therefore, we are stuck perpetually subsidizing bus trips to make them affordable to the commuters who do not have access to cars, and this pool is insufficient to make bus costs competitive. Now, this actually sounds to me like a pretty accurate description of our transit history. I want to generalize this bus analysis and say it applies to all mass transit, but precision here is critical to avoid mistakes. The cost challenges are clearly greater for a bus because it is mass transit, more specifically because it's a large volume vehicle. The bigger the bus, the higher the acquisition and operating costs. But as the analysis showed, those could be overcome with sufficient ridership. The real issue is the speed problem. The speed problem with buses does not actually attribute to them being large vehicles. Rather, it comes from the way the architecture uses the vehicles. We deploy them in dense cover, shared use, fixed route, fixed schedule service. It's because they are fixed route that the rider must spend time walking. It's because they are fixed schedule that the rider must spend time waiting. And it's because they are dense cover shared that the rider must waste time stopping frequently along his way. It's also because they are fixed route that the rider loses additional time by traveling a less direct and therefore longer distance path. So this is what should be generalized. All dense cover, fixed route, fixed schedule service will fail to attract car users in significant numbers. But this statement applies to rail. You ask, aren't rail systems better? Well, not if they're dense cover. Look at Miami's Metro Rail with 300 passenger trains carrying on average 2.69 passengers per mile. Look at almost every streetcar system operating in America and most LRT systems. But how about the subways in New York and Chicago? Okay, we have to acknowledge those. But what makes them work are a set of conditions not found often. Extremely high local parking costs and crippling congestion severely degrade the utility of cars. Exclusive guideways give transit a significant speed advantage. Then extremely high demand permits the system to operate economically even with very short headways. Finally, the built infrastructure actually make subway stations a shorter walk than the parking garages. So there may be exceptions in the very densest urban cores, but mainly, even those don't actually have a good fare ratio. Remember, 85% of the urban dwellers live in the suburbs. How does the subway work in the suburbs, or LRT for that matter? Answer is it doesn't. They're designed to get suburban dwellers into and out of the city. They do not serve movement within the suburbs very well at all, which means they only serve a small portion of the commutes out there. The overall point is, relative to cars, the dense cover, fixed route, fixed schedule model has many opportunities to lose time, walking, waiting, and stopping, and only one opportunity to gain time, vehicle speed. It takes extraordinary circumstances for this combination to result in the model even staying marginally competitive with cars, let alone to win. So in the vast majority of cases, it will fail to attract riders from cars. It's time we look at other deployment models for public transit. To sum up this presentation, what do I hope you take away? First, I hope you take away a willingness to face reality. Mass transit is a failure today and will be a failure always. It's too expensive to be supported by the 5% of commuters who do not have access to a car, and it's too slow to attract the 90% of commuters who do have access to a car. It's a partial solution at best to the commuter's need for personal door-to-door transportation. Buses, trains, or flying gondolas, it doesn't matter. The failure is in the architecture, not in the technology. Second, I hope you take away a determination to start looking beyond mass transit for other transit architectures that can work, and for full end-to-end solutions. But at a minimum, you should take away a better understanding of what it is that's broken with mass transit, so they're, how best to patch over it. It's not clear the speed problems can be overcome, so ridership's going to remain low. It is therefore essential that the cost be lowered. The obvious way to do this is with automation and likely smaller vehicles. Thanks for investing your time in this presentation. I may have delivered bad news, but I hope that at least it's useful news. Now that we've torn down the old, the next presentation looks at rebuilding the new.